They're not people that we really know anything about. They're just there. So we've come to the end of the book, and we just have the credits, is what it feels like. But you may know that there is a movie series that in this movie series, when you get to the credits, instead of everyone getting up and leaving, this particular movie series, when people go to see it, no one goes anywhere when the credits goes onto the scene or goes onto the screen. Some of you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever seen a Marvel movie in a theater, then you know that at the moment when usually everyone stands up to leave, in a Marvel movie, no one gets up. And if it's your first time there, you don't know what's going on, it's kind of confusing. Like, why are all these people staring at all these names? Like, there's nothing particularly interesting about the credits. In fact, it takes a lot of people to make a Marvel movie, so there are even more people than usual. They're more boring than usual. But Marvel has this thing that they're well known for, that at the end of the credits or in the middle of the credits, they put a scene from a movie that hasn't been released yet. It's a preview of the next movie, or at least an upcoming movie in the Marvel series. So you're rewarded by getting through the credits with a hidden reward, right? Like a hidden treasure that you find in the middle of this boring list of names. And I think Romans 16 is actually more like that. Because when we get to Romans 16 and we're wondering, like, why am I still here? There are all these names that I don't know anything about. We actually, in the middle of those names, we find a hidden treasure that informs us of actually why Paul wrote this letter really in the first place. And I want you to see this. Like I said, it's going to be on the screen. Most of the time, the words are going to be bigger than this. You probably can't read that from where you are. But I did that on purpose because that is a list of a bunch of names from Romans 16, verses 3 through 15. And like I said, these are the credits of the book. They're scrolling on the screen, not super interesting, except there's a hidden treasure. Because hopefully you can see the highlights to some extent that are on the screen now. You can see the yellow highlights, the red highlights, the brown highlights. Those are highlighting different types of names. So the ones that are highlighted in yellow are traditional Jewish names, things like Prisca and Aquila in the beginning. The ones highlighted in red are traditional Roman names. They're in Latin. So Urbanus and Julia, for instance. And the ones highlighted in brown are Greek names. So Olympus, if you could guess, that is indeed a Greek name. So is Hermes, or Hermes. So there's some very obviously Greek names there. So you can see that there are these three different types of names. There are three different ethnicities represented here in Romans 16. And that gives us a glimpse into why Paul wrote this letter. Because if you're reading through Romans 16, you'll see that he addresses several different house churches in the ancient city of Rome. And then he even names these people, right? So what we're learning about these churches is that they're pretty diverse. Like, they have these different ethnicities present within their network of churches. And diversity is a good thing in the Bible, but all is not well in paradise here, right? Because once we get to verse 17 of Romans 16, Paul says, "I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you have been taught. Avoid them." So there's something going on here, and Paul is not a fan of it, right? So these people are already different. They're coming from different backgrounds. But not only are they different, they're divided. Like this beautiful coming together is coming together about like oil and water. Like it's not going very well. So in this church, we have Jews, we have Romans, we have Greeks, we have different ethnicities. But it's not just that. It's that these different ethnicities are manifesting themselves in ways that are different in real life. And it has to do with stuff that you and I really care about. So we're going to get to that in a minute. But first, if you've ever learned to play an instrument, then you know the importance of the scales, right? So like if you learn how to play guitar, you're never going to learn to play guitar like Jimi Hendrix if you don't play hundreds or even thousands of hours of the scales. Scales are not exactly fun. They're kind of like the movie credits in that way. They're not the most interesting thing, but they are necessary in order to get to a more advanced level, right? So in this analogy, Jimi Hendrix is like Romans 14 and 15, and the scales are Romans 12 and 13. And that's not supposed to tear down Romans 12 and 13, because Romans 12 is one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible. But the point is that we can't get to the chapters of Romans 14 and 15 without chapters 12 and 13. So I'll go ahead and tell you, our goal for this sermon, and then next week we'll continue these thoughts. Our goal is to spend some time in Romans 14 and 15. But in order to get there, we need to talk about Romans 12 and 13. And really, you can't make sense of Romans 14 and 15 without not only chapters 12 and 13, but also the first 11 chapters of Romans. So we're going to give a really fast overview of those 11 leading up to chapter 12. So what Paul has done in Romans is to tell us that he has a dream, okay? He dreams of a unified, multi-ethnic family of God. That's his dream. For a family that comes together, that's different but unified. Not uniformity, not everyone wearing the same uniform, looking the same, but unity. Unity in spite of differences. So that's Paul's dream. And that's what if you've ever read Romans, you know that's pretty deep, right? It's pretty confusing at points. And that's what all the deep doctrine that he packs into chapters 1 through 11 is all about. It's all in service of this dream. Because this church is struggling with divisions. Like they have the different part down, that they're diverse, but they're not unified. They're struggling through divisions. And Paul's basic message, his antidote to their division, can really be boiled down to one word. That's the word die, like to put it bluntly. That's the solution. Because this is at least one way of thinking of the book of Romans. Chapter 1, the beginning of the book, through chapter 3 and verse 20, is a death cycle. Paul is laying out what it looks like as a human to be spiritually dead. He just mentions all kinds of terrible things that people get themselves wrapped up in. So that's what it looks like to be spiritually dead. Chapter 3, 21 through the end of chapter 11 is the principle of life through death. So Paul gets this from the life of Jesus, right? Because Jesus finds life by going through death. And in fact, Jesus gives all of us life through his own death. So that's the principle that Paul picks up on. For instance, in Romans 6, when he talks about going down into a watery grave of baptism, is what we call it sometimes, and we come up to walk with a new life, right? That's life through death. So that's the principle that Paul sees at work in so much of our reality, that life only comes through death. So we go from the death cycle, life through death, and we end up in chapters 12 through 16 with the life cycle. This is what it looks like for Paul to be spiritually alive, to go through death and come out on the other side as a spiritually alive human and group of humans. So for Paul, just like with Jesus, to get to the life cycle, you have to go through death. The solution to all of the dividing and bickering and fighting is really a double death. The death of Jesus combined with our own deaths. And that brings us to Romans chapter 12. And if you might have noticed, if you're here most Sundays, that we normally have a scripture reading kind of at the beginning of service. We didn't do that this time because I'm about to read a big old chunk of scripture. But I wanted to give you that context to lead up to it so you have some idea of what's been coming. So we're going to read from Romans 12. And again, this is on the screen. And I'm going to try to remember to advance the slides as I read it. I guess actually I'll just read it from here. And I'll make myself advance the slides. So we're going to read Romans 12. And then we're going to read a little bit of chapter 13. It's a big old chunk, but I want us to experience together the scales. I want us to go through this chapter and to see the basics of what it looks like to live as a spiritual human who's come through spiritual death and is now spiritually alive. Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them, if prophecy in proportion to our faith, if service in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And if you're reading along in your Bible, drop down to verse 7. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For Paul, this is what it looks like to live. This is what it looks like to live as the multi-ethnic, unified family of God. These are the scales. And just like the scales on an instrument, they're not always fun. Like some people enjoy playing the scales. Most people enjoy them sometimes, but most of the time you're playing the scales, it's not because you really want to be playing the scales, right? And that's how these are. I mean, if we're just skimming through them, some of these are great. Some of these, like, I can implement right now and I'd have a great time. But other ones, outdo one another in showing honor. Doesn't sound that hard on the surface, but it's really hard to outdo one another in showing honor. It's really hard to celebrate someone else's success when I think it should be mine, right? That's a really hard thing to do. And what about never be wise in your own sight? I fail at that one. You know, like right now, I'm telling you, I fail at that one. That is hard. Another one, repay no one evil for evil. What do you do when someone cuts you off on the road? Don't say it, don't sign it, whatever you do, don't do it out loud. But whatever you do, that's a tough situation, right? And that's like the most minor of evil that we experience in our lives. Repay no one evil for evil. What about the last one here up on the screen? Pay taxes to whom taxes are owed. Chris likes that. Everybody else, no. Chris does not like that, but he will help you do it. Taxes are not fun. Taxes, this is like time of year, right, where hopefully we've all started working on them or are procrastinating in dread of them. It's not fun. And arguably, it is way less fun than playing the scales, like an actual instrument scales. These scales are not very fun. So our question is, why would we live like that? Why should I care about this unified, multi-ethnic family of God? Why should I go through any scales? Like, why should I not just say, peace out, I'm out, like, y'all do your thing, I'm going out, right? In other words, why should we love one another? Why should I love you enough to have a really awkward conversation with you when I could just ignore it and let it pass, right? Like, not that we shouldn't do that sometimes, but there are some times when the most loving thing is to have a really weird conversation. Why should I love you enough to do that? Why should I love you enough not to avoid you, right? This is a pretty big room. It's not that hard to avoid someone that you don't like in here. Why should I love you enough not to avoid you? Why should we love one another? Why do we go through these scales? Well, one answer is what Paul gets to in verse 11 of this chapter. And this is, I'll just warn you right now, not exactly how we normally talk, but we're going to talk about it after we read it. He says, "The hour has come for you to wake from sleep, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime." And he goes on to say, don't do these sinful things. So you might be wondering what just happened in these verses, right? That's a lot of metaphorical language. Well, in his own way, Paul is communicating to us that we, as followers of Jesus, live in this paradoxical continuum, if I can put it like that, this paradoxical continuum where the sun has risen, but it's still night. And this is not denying the darkness of our world. Like, we can't deny the reality of sin and corruption and perversion that's all around us, right? So we're not ignoring the darkness of our world. But the Christian realizes that the sun has risen. And what we do is live in realization of that fact. We're like little candles that are receiving our flame from the sun coming across the horizon. The sun of Jesus getting up from his own grave, saying that our world looks very dark right now, but we know that the sun is coming, right? The sun is rising because it already has risen. So we're like little candles being lit by that sun. And as far as one reason why I think church is important for all of us is because when my candle is kind of flickering, when my candle's about to go out, sometimes I just need one of y'all to be like a Cogsworth and just lean over and give me a light, right? But I think part of what Paul is getting at is not only do I need that from you, but you need that from me. In other words, church and life is not just about me. I think that's a big part of what he's getting at here. We'll talk more about it in a second. But in light of that, we're going to move on from the scales. Paul says, let's get specific. So in chapters 14 and 15 of Romans, he introduces us to two groups in the Roman churches. On the one hand, you have the weak. Sorry for this side of the room, but y'all are the weak. On the one hand, you have the weak. And on the other hand, he calls the other group the strong. All right? So you have the weak and the strong. The Jewish Christians, some of whom we read about in Romans 16, are the weak in this case. And the Roman and Greek Christians, we're just going to call them the Gentiles, which comes from a Greek word that the Jews used to refer to all the people who were not Jews. So if you want an explanation, we're just going to call them the Gentiles. So the weak are the Jews, the strong are the Gentiles. Now, why is that the case? Why is this group the weak group and this group the strong group? Well, part of it goes back to some historical context. So if you go back just a few years before this, before Romans was written, the Jews had been exiled from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. This is in AD 49. The Emperor Claudius has said every Jew has to leave this city. We know this from history. We also know this from the Bible. It's mentioned in Acts chapter 18, verse 2. And Ken, I think the clickers decided to give out on me. So Acts 18 and verse 2. This is Paul. He comes to Corinth and he meets a Jew named Aquila, who we actually already read about in Romans 16, right? So he meets Aquila, a native of Pontus, which is in Italy. He's recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So Claudius has exiled every Jew from the city of Rome. And this is the decade leading up to the big Jewish revolt that you might have heard about. And so the Jewish people are already not very high on the empire's list of favorites, right? And apparently they've been causing some trouble in Rome. So just imagine your entire life is in this city. You've always lived here. You've always lived in this house maybe. And all of a sudden you have a day to pack up your stuff. And then a Roman guard escorts you out of the city. So they're kicked out. All of these Jews, and including Jewish Christians, many of whom were probably leaders in the church there. Because think about it, the gospel goes to the Jews first, right? So they're probably at least most of the leaders of the Roman church at this point. And all of a sudden, they're kicked out. So their lives are turned upside down. Well, fast forward 5 years, and the emperor passes away, and they're allowed back into the city. So many of them start to come back. But in those years that they were gone, the churches that they were a part of kept cruising, right? They didn't, at least some of them, didn't stop existing. They kept going, but they had to adapt and find new ways to exist without their Jewish brothers and sisters. And now, those brothers and sisters are back, which is great, right? Welcome home. But also, it comes with a lot of problems, new problems for these churches. Because for one, even though they're back in, this entire ethnic group is in a very vulnerable place, right? That's what happens when you get kicked out. Even when you're back in, you are kind of starting at the bottom, right? You're starting on a very low rung of the social ladder. So here the Jewish people are. many ways still outcasts. And their leaders coming back to these churches, many of whom that they probably helped start. And they're just totally different. They don't even observe the Sabbath anymore. They don't observe any, in fact, of the holy feasts of Judaism. And maybe even worse than that, they're eating barbecue and fried catfish. They're not observing any of the kosher diets of Judaism. Potlucks, what we would call potlucks, were a really big part of early church life. And they had to be super awkward at this point. Because imagine coming to these potlucks and one of, let's say that this side of the room thinks it's a sin to eat chicken. If that's a sin, I'm in big trouble. But this side of the room thinks that it's a sin to eat chicken. This side of the room, all you want to eat is chicken. I'm probably on this side of the room. And let's say we have a potluck where this side of the room just brings a bunch of chicken. This side of y'all are outnumbered, by the way, so y'all are in trouble. But this side of the room is going to have a really big problem with that, right? Everyone on this side thinks it's a sin to eat chicken, and all they're doing is eating chicken. So it's going to be a really awkward potluck. It's like Thanksgiving, where you don't see eye to eye with one of your family members. It's just awkward. There's a tension in the room, right? There's a grit at what's happening. And for the Jewish people here, their perspective is that this side of the room has forgotten where they came from. These customs are what God's people have done for thousands of years. In fact, this is what made them a people as opposed to any other people. This is what identified them as a people. This is who they've always been. This is like if someone just takes away Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they take away freedom of speech. They take away Saturdays on the lake or tailgating or whatever it is that makes America America. They take it away. So who are we without all the America stuff, right? Who are we without that? So that's what they're going through. But it's more than that, because it's not about just losing their cultural practices. They can do those on their own time, in their own houses. So to some extent, it's not as much about that as it is, the problem is that this is affecting their church life, right? And it's not just like disagreeing on what color the carpet should be in the church building. It's not just redecorating the church foyer. Those things can be tricky for churches to navigate. But these are deeper. We're about to read Romans 14, the first 5 verses. But in verse 1 of Romans 14, Paul mentions opinions. I'll go ahead and put it on the screen. I already did, didn't I? He mentions opinions in verse 1. When you and I think of opinion, at least for me, I think of something that doesn't matter all that much, right? Like the fact that cookies and cream ice cream is the best type of ice cream. And that's my opinion. You are wrong if you don't agree, but I will admit that it's my opinion, right? That's what I think of when I think of an opinion. But what this is talking about is something deeper than that. This is referring to like a deeply held religious belief, conviction, that they've reasoned from the scriptures. So this is serious. To them, this is very, very serious. And that's why Paul calls them weak. It's not because they don't know their Bible. It's not because they don't love Jesus. It's not because they don't care enough to study it honestly. It's not because they don't have enough faith. None of those things. He calls them weak because their faith won't allow them to do things that the strong, in Paul's terminology, are capable of doing, feel comfortable doing. So on the one side of the room, you have that is sinful. On the other side of the room, you have I am free to do this. So what do, right? This is a heavy, complicated mixture of deeply rooted cultural and spiritual practices. So what do you do with it? Well, let's read what Paul says. He says, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes that he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. So the Jews are insisting that everyone observe the Sabbath and a kosher diet, and the Gentiles are saying that every day is the same as another, and my steak is just as good and holy and spiritual and scriptural as your salad is, right? So they're at an impasse. What do? Where do they go at this point? Well, Paul says double death is the answer. Really, triple death is the answer. Because he says this side of the room needs to die to your way of doing things. And this side of the room needs to die to your way of doing things. And all of this is possible and preferable because Jesus died to his way of doing things, right? It's a triple death. That is the solution to this in Paul's mind. So if we keep reading in Romans chapter 14, he says, each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. So the person who is weak, this is his motivation. He's observing it in honor of the Lord. But notice, also the person who's strong, the one who eats in honor of the Lord. Both sides, this is their motivation, since he gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. So Paul takes this conversation to the most basic level of life and death itself. And he says, this is bigger than any one of us, right? This is about the big old unified, multi-ethnic family of God. And in a family, we don't always get our way. Now, I don't know about you. I have 3 siblings. I experienced a lot growing up. My siblings would probably say I got my way more than they did. But, I'm the only one here. So I'm going to say I experienced a lot growing up of not getting my way, right? Because that's family. That's how family works. And this is why we practice the scales. This is why we do the things of Romans chapter 12 and 13. Because the person I am, when I'm going through those documents to turn in for my taxes, the person I am on my taxes is the same person I am in a heavy, complicated, emotional conflict between the people in this room. The person I am on the scales of Romans 12 and 13 is the same person I am on the Jimi Hendrix of Romans 14 and 15. Keep reading with me in Romans 14. He says, for if we live to the Lord. I won't be able to read all this since we're running out of time, but if we die to the Lord. Just skipping to the end, these questions. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? Now this is tough because this bucks against so much of our modern conception of church. Most people in our culture, if I have read the culture correctly, if you go up to them and ask them what church is about, they would say it's about getting saved, going to heaven, becoming a better person, developing a better relationship with God. And all of those things are true, right? But all of those things are also about me. So they're not the full picture. Church is not just about me getting saved, me becoming better, me developing a relationship with God. It's about us. Church is bigger than just me. When we're born, life is about me, right? At least most babies I've ever met. Life is all about them. When they're hungry, you know it. When they're sleepy, you know it. When they're thirsty, you know it. Because life is about them. And to some extent, all of us still live in that state, right? Like to some extent, all of our lives are still about me. There's at least little nooks and crannies of our lives that still belong to me, right? But in that way, but to whatever extent we remain in that comfortable place, we're like Peter Pan. We never grow up. And that's tempting. I can see, it's understandable, right, for a child. But for an adult, when we live in that little place, comfortable, well-lit room of our own self-regard, we never enter into the adventure of being a human being. We never enter into the adventure of living a life that's bigger than my own, of being a part of something that's bigger than just me. And Paul says that is what church is all about. It's not about me. It's about all of us. We might say that church is a covenant community. I think a lot of people, for church is just something that we decide to attend. But what church is supposed to be is a place where we agree to serve. It's not the language of they. Like, I can't believe that they did that, or he said that, or she dressed like that. It's not the language of they. It's the language of we. It's the difference between living in an orphanage and being adopted. Like, we don't just share space in here. We're in this together. That's what Paul's getting at in Romans 14. Keep reading it in verse 10. He says, we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. All of us. So then, he says, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. Now, that's tough. Because if I'm being honest, I probably like to judge you. Like, it makes me feel better about myself to look down on you, right? You may experience the same thing with me, with other people. But none of us is the judge. That's what Paul says here. In fact, we are all going to be judged. So what do I do if I don't get my way? Or what do I do when I might not get my way? What do I do when my brother or my sister wants something different from me? Just to throw out some examples, and the first one is kind of a hypothetical, but I think it's interesting on a church-wide scale to think about. What do we do if a big old group of people become a part of our church who want to worship in Spanish? What do we do? That's kind of a hypothetical. We've spoken English from the beginning of our church, I'm pretty sure. But it's also kind of real in the sense that the middle school across the church, about a third of the students come from Spanish-speaking homes. So that's our community. What do we do if that happened? Now, what do we do if someone in here has political beliefs that I disagree with? Oh, right. What do we do if someone has biblical beliefs that I disagree with? What if someone leads a song or prays a prayer or preaches a sermon even that I disagree with? Now, what do we do if I disagree with how someone dresses when they come in here, right? Like, what if I think that they should be more formal or they should be less formal? What do? That might be a belief that's reasoned from the Scriptures, right? It's not just my opinion in the sense that Oreo ice cream is the best. It's an opinion that's been reasoned, deeply held from the Scriptures. What do? And Paul doesn't necessarily say here that those differences don't matter, right? He doesn't say that we should just sweep everything under the rug, that we should just ignore any and all differences and avoid any awkward conversations. He doesn't say that. It just means that all of this is bigger than that. Like, everything that happens here is bigger than those issues. The church is about people, not issues. There's something bigger at play. What Paul says is that those practices don't define who's in and who's out. He says that Jesus' family welcomes in even you and even me, right? We're welcomed in, even with all of our flaws. We're welcome. So, when we disagree on things like that, things that are important but are not essential, we have to learn to respect each other's differences. We don't have time for anything else because this is the type of love that will heal and unify Jesus' family. Now that is Paul's non-negotiable, right? He says there's room for all of us, but there's not room. He leaves no room for excluding or minimizing or crowding out each other from this family based on those issues. He has no tolerance for things like that. He has no tolerance for me standing at the door, checking what version of the Bible you are using as you walk in. That's not to say that translations of the Bible don't matter, that they're all the same, but it does mean that this is bigger than that. Paul says that is not something that we should fight over. Discuss? Yes. Fight over, exclude, minimize, crowd out? No. He has no tolerance for me looking down on you for wearing the wrong brand of clothing, right? Whether it's to church or to somewhere else. He has no tolerance for me judging you based on who you vote for. And again, it's not that these differences don't matter at all and that we should just sweep them under the rug and live happy ever after and just ignore everything, right? That's not how family works, at least when it's healthy. You know, if we only see our family like a few times a year, it's relatively easy to be like, you know, I don't really agree with Uncle Ricky on everything, but I don't really need to talk about stuff with Uncle Ricky. I'll just see him at Thanksgiving and get through it. But I don't know about you, but in my experience, in my family, when I ignore issues like that, it keeps the peace, but it keeps genuine connection from happening. I can't grow in connection with someone that I can't actually talk with. So if we're going to be this unified, multi-ethnic family of God, it's not that we need to sweep everything under the rug. We need to have these awkward conversations, but we also need to have them in a way that we both realize that this doesn't determine whether you're in or out, and it doesn't determine whether I'm in or out. We have to have some room for grace. I think there's something beautiful about this because there's something about the deep and awkward waters of conflict that leads to us having something that we wouldn't have otherwise. I'll end with this quote from C.S. Lewis. The clicker gave out again, Ken. So this quote from C.S. Lewis says, and this, again, he wrote it kind of a while ago, so it might be kind of hard to discern what he's saying, but hopefully you can follow. He says, the especial glory of affection is that it can unite those who most emphatically, even comically, are not, in context saying they're not made for one another. So you might not hang out with the other people in this room in any other context than church. But he says there's something special about this. He says people who, if they had not found themselves put down by fate in the same household or community, would have nothing to do with each other. If affection grows out of this, and of course it often does not, their eyes begin to open. Growing fond of old so-and-so, at first simply because he happens to be there, I presently begin to see that there is something in him after all, The moment when one first says, really meaning it, that though he is not my sort of man, he is a very good man in his own way. I've definitely said this, right? It's a very good man in his own way, is one of liberation. It does not feel like that. We may feel only tolerant and indulgent, but really, we have crossed the frontier. That, in his own way, means that we are getting beyond our own idiosyncrasies, that we are learning to appreciate goodness or intelligence in themselves, not merely goodness or intelligence flavored and served to suit our own palate. Church is bigger than you and me. And what we learn from Genesis 1, the very beginning of this whole story, is that every person in here is made in the image of God, right? Like if we look in a mirror, we see the image of God. But also, when you put a bunch of images of God in the same place, it sometimes feels like a mirror maze, at least to me, right? I don't know if you've ever been in a mirror maze. I really don't know why people pay to go into a mirror maze. I don't think it's really fun. But it's this thing that's really confusing that you're trying to get through, and it doesn't work. The mirrors aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're just everywhere, and it's so confusing. And sometimes that's church. Sometimes that's a bunch of people who might never hang out if it weren't for this space right here coming together. But I think what Paul is calling us to is to say that my way of doing things doesn't have to be our way of doing things. It's not my way or the highway. It's Jesus' way. That's what we're all here to do. So we're here to die to ourselves, just like Jesus died to himself, and let him live through all of us. And in doing that, to find some kind of special something inside of each other that we may never have found otherwise. So that's what Paul is calling us to in Romans 14. If you need to start walking with Jesus, if you haven't started that, now's the time to do it. Just come forward or talk with someone close to you, and they will introduce you to the Jesus that we're all following. And we can start by going into the waters of baptism, where we spiritually die to ourselves, and we come up to live genuine life. If you want to do that this morning, why don't you, as we stand and sing together?